Bruce, thanks so much for coming on the show. Before we jump into your why, I'd like to ask you a few questions so our audience can learn a little bit about you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So, can you tell us a little bit about your professional and personal background, like what you did before starting your podcast?
Well, that's a good question because my business is called Now Hear This, or sometimes I'll use the legal name and say Now Hear This Incorporated. And so for years, and when I say for years, it's going back, I think it became incorporated in the state of Florida in 2004, maybe. That company was set up to manage, promote, and book musicians. So singer-songwriters, people like that. Eventually, over time, I developed it further because my whole professional career had always been in communications, which is media relations, public relations, marketing, the web, social media. And so I took that experience and all my knowledge and background and decided, well, I could actually apply this to other industries. I don't just have to continue working only with the music industry. So I have been able to get other clients outside that, such as authors, small businesses. I even had an Olympic athlete as a client. And so that's really what I was doing and for all intents and purposes still am. It's just that, as we'll talk about, podcasting obviously became a big part of it.
All right. So, before starting your podcast, did you share online? Did you have a social presence, or how did that look for you?
Before starting the podcast, it would be things that businesses would typically do to show people what they are doing as a company. So in other words, a company Facebook page, a company Twitter page, a company LinkedIn page. But I think what you're doing when you do it that way, as opposed to what you're doing when you're doing it the way that you and I are going to talk about, are two totally different approaches.
Okay. So, what prompted you to start the podcast?
Well, that's always fun to talk about. And I think it's something that is a good lesson for people because I knew about podcasting. In fact, I had just gone to a great e-marketing group presentation about podcasting that I think kind of nudged me and pushed me over the line to say, okay, I'm going to start. I wanted to reach more people for my business. And what was a benefit to me was I had access to a recording studio. So it became real easy for me to start because, like I said, I had sort of been bitten by the podcasting bug. And right away, you just want to start. And so a lot of the things that a potential new podcaster is going to ask themselves will include, well, wait a minute, how do I actually record this thing? So when you have access to a recording studio, you say, okay, well, now I know how I can do it. And the reason I started it is, like I said, I just wanted a more broad reach for my company. And, you know, my vision at the time was maybe there will be some guy who's listening in, you know, St. Louis that hears my podcast and says, oh, this Bruce guy seems to know his stuff. I wonder if he can manage and promote me from across the miles. You know, I'm a singer-songwriter. I've released X amount of albums and I play live shows, et cetera. So that was really kind of what kickstarted me to say, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to start recording a weekly podcast.
Okay. So, the reason that you started was to create sort of like a sales funnel, like a lead generation for your business. Was it a conscious choice for you to start having influence through the podcast from the beginning, or is that something that just happened over time?
Not necessarily. I think I wanted to be looked upon as an expert, so to speak, but it was more about wanting the listeners to conclude that I obviously was well qualified in the entertainment industry, that they should contact me to see about working for them regardless of our geographic locations. And this was started, so the podcast, by the way, is called Now Hear This Entertainment. And just a really quick tip for people when you're starting a podcast, it's as easy as just going on iTunes to look and make sure no one else is already using the same name that you are, or I should say Apple Podcasts, and they don't want us to call it iTunes anymore. But because my business was called Now Hear This, I thought, well, I'll just call this the Now Hear This podcast. And I looked and someone else was already using it. And I thought, well, since I'm going to be interviewing guests who are having success in entertainment, primarily music, I'll just call it Now Hear This Entertainment. And that was available. And so I got it started up. But yeah, it was really just a case of I'm going to do this and hopefully people will see me as an expert. That was in February of 2014 that my first episodes were launched. And I almost feel like the word influencer, I mean, obviously the word existed, but the way that it's used today, I don't really think in February 2014, there was as much of an emphasis on being an influencer as there is now, as there's been over the last couple of years. So I don't think I was looking at it as, hey, I can become an influencer. I think it was, people will see me as an expert. And like you said, it'll get them into my funnel and hopefully I can take them on as a client.
Okay. So what are your reasons today to continue your podcast? Like, how has your reason changed? I mean, when you first started the podcast, it was to create a sales funnel, but is that still the purpose of your podcast today, or has that changed for you?
Oh gosh, it has changed so much. It's one of those, if I knew more than 5 years ago what I knew now about what podcasting truly is, I probably would have gone in with an entirely different approach. And so now, you know, do I do it so that someone will hopefully hear me and say, I'd like this guy to work for me, I'd like to hire him? Sure, you know, that's still an option, but that's not the only reason that I do it. And I think now it has become also a vehicle for me to show what I can do in the world of podcasting, that perhaps someone will hear it and say, I'd like to hire this guy just to do a podcast for me. And I'm not even talking about, can I go to him and record my podcast, or can I get him to edit my podcast, or can he market my podcast for me? I'm talking about someone may hear it and say, okay, this guy is a pro at what he does week in and week out. And I think I'd like to see if, because, you know, obviously one thing that has not changed over the years is companies are always looking for ways to save money. And instead of spend all kinds of money and time on retraining an employee, not to mention what that does to an employee in terms of, oh, great, you're piling more work on me. Now I got to learn about podcasting and you're not going to give me any extra money for this. Well, if all of a sudden you can just contract out with an expert to do it for you, now I look at it as, this is establishing credibility for me in the podcast industry. So now it's also getting me more speaking opportunities. It's funny that I stumble over saying speaking opportunities. And so there's just so much that I see the longer I'm in it and the more possibilities, that by no means am I only doing it every week. Not to mention that I knew when I started it that I was going to need to get a guest every week. But I think back then I just thought, I need a guest. And now I look back and I see all the tremendous connections that I've made and all the contacts that you can get from having a podcast. And mind you, I will go out of my way to say that I do think it's a lot different when you do a show that's as long as mine, because now hear this, entertainment, the episodes are 45, 50, 55 minutes long. So you're really having a really substantial conversation with someone that you can actually form the basis to build a relationship from. I think if you're doing a podcast and you're talking to someone for 5, 6, 7 minutes, it's really tough at that point. And now I call upon these people for a lot of different things. And I just think that it has so helped me tremendously to build up my network that that's nothing that I ever could have foreseen in February of 2014 when I started it up.
That's awesome. So I guess since we're on this topic, what kind of doors are opening or have opened for you in regards to podcasting or the community that you've built through the process of it?
So I'm about to go to an event in Nashville, which I'm going in on a media pass, which again, you know, at the bottom of the screen, it should say results not typical. I don't want people to think if they start a podcast that they can get into any event they want on a media pass, because they can't. It really is going to vary from one to the next. I used to get into this same event by way of a guest badge from someone else, but to now be able to show people that, hey, this is legitimate and this is the value that I'm giving you by you allowing me to come in as media, that all of a sudden becomes something that I can say, there's this expression that, you know, it's because of my show. You know, I'm able to go and sit down in Roy Orbison Jr.'s home and have a real in-depth discussion about the music industry and how can we help each other because of my show. If you think about someone like Roy Orbison Jr., you say, how would I ever go sit in his dining room and have lunch with him if I was just Bruce who runs Now Hear This. You're not going to. But all of a sudden it's, well, we made this nice relationship with each other. We had this long interview. I like you. Look me up when you come to town. And so things like that. And then, as I mentioned before, speaking opportunities. I think when I first started to see that this podcast might lead me to some speaking opportunities, I think even then it was sort of tunnel vision of, I can get booked in the entertainment industry. Maybe I can speak at some music events. And all of a sudden, the more I got onto it and the more successful I was with podcasting, I realized, well, wait a minute, I'm going to podcasting events and seeing speakers. I can be a speaker too. I can be up there and talk about how to promote your podcast, which is typically what I speak about. So there's so many doors that have been opened up, not to mention that there's a presentation that I give about the power of podcasting, expanding your reach and enhancing your brand. And one of the first things that I tell people, because that's attended by people who don't currently have a podcast, one of the things that I'll say is, you start off going from, in my case, I was quote unquote just Bruce Wawrzyniak, who ran Now Hear This. Well, then I became Bruce Wawrzyniak, who runs Now Hear This, and as a podcaster. And eventually I started to get these speaking opportunities that we're talking about. So then you become business owner, podcaster, and speaker. And eventually I launched my ebook series, which was born out of my podcast. And then you're all of a sudden business owner, podcaster, speaker, and author. So the opportunities that you get are a lot more, as I said, than I thought they could be when I first started.
Well, that's great. Well, congrats by the way, for where you've gotten so far.
Thank you.
As far as having impact on people, is there a moment for you where you realized that it was more than a sales funnel and this podcast started having to impact on people? Are there any like stories that come to mind of maybe someone that reached out to you and said, hey, this episode had an impact on me, or anything like that?
There's I promise I'll keep them brief, but there's three different stories that come to mind under that umbrella. I know there's one that you want me to tell, which is in March of this year, we were at Podfest Multimedia Expo in Orlando, and there was an after party, and someone who had been a guest on my podcast randomly showed up at the after party, as in, for all intents and purposes, had no business being there because you had to have a badge, you had to be connected with the conference. And how she got in there, I don't need to get into it, but here she is. She's a singer, songwriter, multi-instrumentalist. She shows up and I'm, wow, okay, this is a nice surprise. Good to see you. What's happening? And so as I'm talking to her, the organizer of the event walks by, stops, taps me on the shoulder. Bruce, everything going good? You enjoying yourself? Yeah. Oh, by the way, I make the introduction as soon as I tell them who each other is. The next thing you know, he says, you sing? Come on, let's get you up on stage. And so here she ends up getting this opportunity just because she knew me and I knew the organizer. The second, and this is a very, very recent example, is and we can talk about this, we haven't gotten into it yet, but I have started a second podcast as of February called Catholic Sports Radio. And I convinced the organizers of what is called the Second Global Congress on Sport and Christianity to book me to speak at that event, even after the speaker's submission deadline had passed. So that started to show me that, okay, I'm on the right track in influencing decision makers, that I can be an asset to their event, or if I'm trying to convince a TV show or a radio show or a podcast, that I can be valuable to them. If I can be an asset as a publicist, a consultant, a manager, like we were talking about earlier. But I think the best example was getting invited by Tascam, who hopefully a lot of people that are hearing me right now know. Tascam has been in business for more than 40 years in the recording industry. They invited me to come to the 2017 Winter NAMM show in Anaheim, California, which is the National Association of Music Merchants. It's the biggest trade show in that industry. It's held over 4 days at the Anaheim Convention Center, and they get over 100,000 people that come, and it's not even open to the public, by the way. So they had me do my Now Hear This Entertainment podcast on site from their booth, what turned out to be 23 interviews in 4 days.
Wow.
And I ended up getting a deal out of that whereby they hired me to do a podcast for them because they saw that, okay, this guy is obviously a pro when it comes to podcasting. So why should we try to get up to speed on all this stuff ourselves when we can just contract it out and let him take care of it all for us the way that it needs to be done? So that was something where I saw that, okay, I'm starting to be looked at as this is a mover and shaker in the podcasting industry. Look at the way he just came in here and filled up our booth, our stage for 4 days for us, and the way he was able to attract talent, meaning performers. And so that's kind of when the light bulb went on that said, okay, I think I've arrived.
That's pretty amazing. So when you recorded those 23 episodes, you scheduled them once a week for roughly 6 months. Is that how you use those?
Well, what happened there was because of the time constraints that Tascam had, they were having me do interviews shorter than I typically do. So what I ended up doing was I was putting, and this is the only time that it's ever been done in the 5+ years of my podcast, but I was putting 2 interviews into one episode. So instead of every episode just having one guest, it was the first half is so-and-so, then there's a little break in between where I was doing housekeeping stuff, promoting my ebooks, things like that. And then we would bring in the second guest on the second half of the show. So it was enough content, yeah, to get me through quite a bit, but it didn't last as long as it sounds like it should have because of the way I had to structure them, which, like I said, was just basically reacting to this is the window of time we're giving you to do these.
Okay. So going back to when you first started your podcast, did you have any barriers you had to overcome to getting it started? Like maybe personal or professional barriers that made you start later than you wanted to, or that you struggled to overcome in the early days?
I think I probably started it quote unquote on time, meaning, as I said earlier, that I had just gotten bit by the podcast bug fully by going to that e-marketing group where I saw the presentation about it. And I knew about podcasting. And because I did have the recording studio, I didn't have that barrier. I think the barrier that I had was, okay, there's so much more to learn about this that I don't think people realize, because people hear about podcasting and all they know is I have an idea. I know that I need equipment of some kind, or basically just tell me how I record it. And then they know it should end up on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all these other platforms. But there's so many details in between that they don't know about, that's when all of a sudden you get excited and you say, wow, I'm going to the studio to record my first few episodes. This is going to be great. And you walk out of there feeling like $1 million. And then you say, okay, so once the studio gets me those files, how do I actually get them out there? And so all of a sudden you start to realize there's all these other things. And I know there's things I would have done differently. For instance, I jumped on Fiverr right away to have somebody design podcast artwork for me, and I probably would have come up with a different look than I've still used to this day. And I know people say you can rebrand. I'm a little stubborn in that regard, that I just choose to stick with it and go. But I think I got it out in a pretty good fashion, time-wise, all things considered.
So it sounds like the main barrier for you was, after getting the audio file, is just figuring out the branding, the getting it pushed out to all the different podcast locations, and just like all the technical aspects.
Facing up to the fact that you don't know what you don't know.
Right. Yeah, you figure it out as you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went through that myself getting started here. How would you say that, starting this podcast has changed for you? Like if you think back to who you were before you started the podcast to who you are today after you've done hundreds of episodes, like how have you changed as just a person, or, the skills that you have, or just how are you different from before you started?
On the one hand, just because of my makeup of who I am as a person, meaning that I really try to stay humble, it's difficult to say that it has changed me. I think the way I view it now is still the same as 5+ years ago, which is being of service to people. I really admire how helpful the podcast community is, and I'm probably drawn to that because that's what I preach so often on Now Hear This Entertainment. Is I'm always telling listeners and guests that we need to focus on the CO word, which is collaboration, and not the CO word, which is competition. I would say that It has probably given me more confidence, though, as far as feeling that I'm just as qualified to be on stage speaking somewhere as the next person is, since I know that I do have a lot to contribute from all my years in podcasting and or in communications. Like I said before, media relations, public relations, marketing, the web, social media. So that's probably been a nice change that, again, getting back to what we talked about earlier, I didn't really, in February of 2014, launch the first episode of Now Hear This Entertainment and say, gee, I hope this gives me more confidence when it comes to pitching myself for XYZ. Mm-hmm. Organically, it has.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, even for me, I've done, I think this is episode 12 now, and I feel like my confidence level for just being an interviewer and speaker has gone up dramatically just from doing a handful of episodes.
Yeah, and I think the difference for me is I've been in broadcasting for many years, on the radio, on television, and it's not so much that I needed more confidence in my speaking so much as you attend conference after conference after conference, workshop after workshop, and you see all these other people up there. And it does take something like putting out lots and lots and lots of podcast episodes to say, hey, you know what? I have content to contribute to a group like this, to an event like this, just as much as that person does. And I have just as much right to be up there as they do. And I know I can get up there and talk. It's just a matter of convincing the organizer of whatever event you want to speak at that, yeah, I do deserve to be looked at as a qualified speaker.
I like that. So moving on a little bit, have you ever struggled with motivation? Posting a episode every week since 2014 is pretty impressive. So I just wondered if you ever struggled with motivation, and if so, if you could share any stories and how you overcame it.
This is going to sound funny, but I'm honestly not a morning person at all, and that can definitely work against you. So an example, though, that has a nice bow on it is that recently, very recently, I got the opportunity to interview the bass player for Pink for my Now Hear This Entertainment podcast. And that's great news, except that she was on tour and they were over in Europe. So the discussion about when are you going to be available to do this, she was proposing what would be 2:00 p.m. Germany time, which meant that it was 7:00 in the morning for me. And by the way, this was going to be on the 4th of July. So I'm thinking, okay, so the 4th of July is 7:00 in the morning, and I'm not a morning person, but wow, this is cool. I get the opportunity to interview the bass player for Pink. So the way I got through it was waking up early enough to warm up my voice and to, again, get in that headspace where I told myself, you need to think about the listeners who are going to be clamoring for this episode because of who the guest is, and who just hopefully always clamor for my episodes. And I told myself, you need to be as enthusiastic and into this as though it was 2:00 my time.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, even in just the first handful of episodes I've done, to get a hold of some of these people, I've either done one really early like that or even really late. I did one at 10 p.m. because the guy was in Australia. So I could see how that could be a struggle.
Yeah, and the ones that are, I've had a couple of those where I've had, like you said, I've had one or two people in Australia where it's like 10:00 at night, Florida time where I am, or I think there was even someone that was only in California, which big deal, 3 hours difference, but I think I had to do that. It was either at 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. I don't mind those. It's the ones in the morning, like I said, because I'm just not a morning person. And I remember when my nieces and nephews were really little, and one of them once said one time, Uncle Bruce doesn't talk in the morning. And it was like, give him an hour from when he wakes up before he'll even open his mouth to say a word. So it's still a thing for me where I'm just not a morning person, but it's really a case of the show must go on. And I think that's kind of what will separate you and what will help you have success is you say, look, I got an opportunity here and this could be a good contact for me. You never know where it might go. It might not go anywhere, but it's showing your dedication to what you're going to do where you don't make excuses and just staying committed and saying, I'm in this for the long haul. I'm not just going to start a podcast to see how it goes and I'm going to reevaluate after 8 weeks or after 6 months or whatever, because you're already setting yourself up for failure. You're going into it with a negative attitude. You're saying there's a potential this thing could fail. You got to go into it and say, this is going to be great. It's going to be fun. I'm going to have a lot of success. I'm in this for the long haul. There is no expiration date on it.
Yeah, you got to do what you got to do to get those episodes out there and those interviews done.
Yeah, because the expression that I like to use is you have a verbal contract with your listeners. So in the case of Now Hear This Entertainment, they know that every Wednesday morning there's going to be a new episode waiting for them. And honestly, Jeremy, when I talk about that podcast, one of the things I brag about the most is the fact that a new episode has been delivered on time every week for almost 5.5 years now. And yes, I do follow it up and tell people about a lot of the really cool guests that have been on there. But I think it's all of that put together that they hear, wow, this show has hit the iTunes top 10 in the music category on a handful of occasions. And a new episode, you can count on it. So it's that if somebody wakes up at whatever time on a Wednesday morning and they're looking for my podcast as they go on their way out the door to work and it's not there, they're going to go, Bruce, you screwed up my routine. What the heck? What am I supposed to do now? So you've got to verbally them that it'll be there.
That's really impressive. Yeah, that's one of the first things that you told me when we first met.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and
it's crucial. It's crucial.
Yeah, it's worth talking about. I'd like to speak a little bit more on motivation. Before we started the interview, you talked about how you recently launched a second podcast. Do you mind talking about some of the struggles that you've been encountering starting like a second podcast on top of the existing one you had for over 5 years?
Yeah, I think the struggle with the second one has been that it sounds logical, but if you start a second podcast, you're going to have twice as much work. And that may sound like common sense, but it's until you actually get into it and you say, whoa, this is twice as much work, meaning it's now taking time away from other things I would normally be doing. And I'm talking about business related. And so all of a sudden, and mind you, this is a weekly podcast too. So you're doing everything that you've been doing for 5+ years, but now you're doing it ×2. And you're saying, well, where do I have room in my schedule to do all this? And so again, it gets back to what we just finished talking about, which is, well, what's your commitment level going to be? And the fact that this one is brand new, you do have to really work even harder at it, because now here's a completely unknown commodity that's not been out there before that you suddenly have to inform as many people as you can about, so that right out of the gate, you build up a good following and you say, okay, this one looks like it's got the potential for what I thought was going to be the case. So it's been a lot of work. At the same time, I enjoy it and I'm already seeing some good things happening from it. So I get excited when, I don't want to say when a new episode of Catholic Sports Radio comes out, because, you know, it's like I talk about on Now Hear This Entertainment. When a performer finally gets on stage, that 90 minutes that they're on stage, those 2 hours that they're on stage, that's the easy part for them, because it's muscle memory. It's kind of the finished product. It's all the work that they do during the day off stage that the people don't see. That's the real grind. And so when a new episode launches for Catholic Sports Radio, yeah, I have to do the promotion for it and let people know a new episode is out. But it's finding those guests. It's looking for an angle for what can I talk about this time that doesn't sound repetitive already, even though I've only got 24 episodes out so far. So, you know, finding new places to promote this podcast that would have no relevance to Now Hear This Entertainment. So it's really taking on quite a full plate, but at the same time, I knew sort of what I was getting into, that I wouldn't have started it if I didn't feel that I was going to be able to give it my all, and if I didn't feel that it was going to be successful. And I do have the benefit of, hey, here's what I did learn in 5+ years with Now Hear This Entertainment that I can do a little bit differently, or here's how this one can benefit from what I have learned.
So I guess since we're talking about this, do you mind, as long as you're comfortable with it, sharing maybe your top 1, 2, or 3 things that you've done for your new podcast and launching it that has really helped it get established pretty quickly?
Well, I will say for people who are interested in getting into podcasting that one mistake that I made with Now Hear This Entertainment was, way back then, I had told my web guy, I'm starting a podcast. I said, apparently we need to host these files somewhere. I don't know. I'm just regurgitating to you something that I've heard. And he said, we can just build it into your website. Yeah, I know what they're talking about. I know kind of, you know, what's supposed to happen with podcasts. And he was teaching me about what an RSS feed is and all that. So he said, I'll just build that into the website for you. Well, then over the years, I started to learn more and more about podcast hosting companies. And so with Catholic Sports Radio, I told myself, I'm putting it on a podcast hosting service because that's going to make it a lot easier for me to get it out to all the different podcast platforms faster and easier, which means quicker. So the fact that Catholic Sports Radio is on iHeartRadio app after only 24 episodes, and yet more than 5 years in, Now Hear This Entertainment is still not on the iHeartRadio app. It shows you one of the benefits of going with a podcast hosting service. Another thing that I've done is honestly just really been more vocal with my guests about saying, look, I'm really going to be looking for recommendations here with other guests that I can get, because on that show I interview, and this is the biggest challenge, you have to be Catholic to be on that show. So right off the bat, that eliminates a whole section of the population. When I then go on to say some connection to sports, so you're a current or a former athlete, coach, official, which means a referee or an umpire, clergy, administrator. And so it's that first part when I say you have to be Catholic, though, that all of a sudden, well, I guess I can't tell you need to get Tim Tebow, because as well known as he is out there as being really into his faith, he's not Catholic. So I had to really rely on asking guests, and it's been wonderful. It's something that I would only do occasionally with Now Hear This Entertainment, and I do it all the time now with Catholic Sports Radio, and it's really been beneficial because a lot of guests have been able to refer me to other people that I've never heard of, or I might have heard of them, but I'd say, oh, he's Catholic? Or they would tell me and I'd say, oh, I guess I didn't know that she was Catholic. And so that's been a real success for me. And then a lot of it is just, practicing what I preach. There's a talk that I give at a lot of podcasting events, which is called 20 plus ways to promote your podcast. And for example, one of the things that really helped me out with Catholic Sports Radio was I wrote a press release announcing the launch of Catholic Sports Radio. And I sent that out, and the Catholic News Service picked it up, and they called me, did a telephone interview with me, and they sent out their own story about it. They wrote an article rather than just reprinting my press release. And so when they send it out, it becomes available to all the papers, all the Catholic radio, all the different media outlets that they serve, that subscribe to their service. And the next thing you know, that thing was showing up in diocesan newspapers from Philadelphia to Indiana to places that I was going, wow, this is pretty neat that all these places are picking this up and printing it that I didn't directly make contact with.
Wow. Yeah, those are all awesome pieces of advice. Do you mind? I'd like to drill into one of them just because it's something I struggle with, and it's to getting more guests. How do you usually ask for recommendations? Do you usually do it at the end of the interview? Do you follow up with email? What do you find that's been successful for you?
I usually do it when I say when the interview is over, it's once I've clicked stop, and so the guest is still on the line, but we're no longer recording. I'll thank them, have some happy talk, just do some pleasantries, and then I'll say, listen, one thing that you can really do that would help me out, because I can generally tell if they've had a good experience. If it's somebody who, wow, this person seems like they weren't really prepared for what we just did, they were just kind of going through the motions, I will make the decision on the spot. I'm just going to let this person hang up. I'm going to thank them and let them continue on with their day. For the overwhelming majority, I'll say right in that moment, listen, one thing that you can do that would really help me out, if you don't mind, I would, and you know that on the other end, they're bracing and saying, oh boy, what does he want? And if all you're doing is asking for a guest referral, you're not really asking for a lot. It's not like you're saying, can you send me a check, or can you buy my this, or can you go and like the Facebook page for the show and follow on Twitter and follow on Instagram. It's like, come on, buddy, enough with the laundry list. So to simply ask them for a guest referral, some of them think of the answer right on the spot. I've had a couple that have said, yeah, actually, who you need to get in touch with is XYZ. Some of them will say, I'll make the introduction for you. Others will say, okay, I'll give it some thought. No one jumps to mind right now. But if I don't ask them, they're not going to know that I need help. And I've even gone so far as to, I don't want to say every episode, but occasionally on the podcast itself, I'll tell people, and usually what I've learned is, and I've just kind of come up with this on my own, is it's a good strategy to get people into the Facebook group, because I will say, don't forget that we have a Facebook group called CSR Listeners for prayer requests or just for fellowship, or if you want to comment on the show. And even if you have suggestions for guests, you can put those for me in the Facebook group, and I'll track the person down unless you already know how to get a hold of them. So all of a sudden, it's doing two things for me. It's getting me more people going into the Facebook group and creating more awareness for it. But it's also giving me a chance for the listening audience to contact me and say, yeah, there's a guy that I know who goes to my church, and he used to play for the insert team here, and he's real active in the church community, et cetera. You should contact him.
Okay, so you have you also have a Facebook group for the podcast, which is sort of your hub for the community.
I have a Facebook group for each podcast, and no surprise, one is called NHTE Listeners, and the other one's called CSR Listeners. The one for Now Hear This Entertainment, I launched that way too late. The one for Catholic Sports Radio, I launched that essentially at the same time that the show was starting, because I knew that I wanted to have one. So I knew that on episode 1, I needed to tell people, look, I'm going to start a Facebook group, and if you want to be in community with one another, let's do it online in a Facebook group. So I think I learned from my experience with Now Hear This Entertainment enough to say that, okay, here's probably what I can do a little bit differently that might give the Facebook group a better chance. I'm not telling you that it's real successful and that I have tons of people in either one of the groups, but at the same time, if you're going to do it, you don't wait to do it until you have, 52 episodes of the show out, because those are 51 missed chances that you could have been telling people. And granted, it does get a little challenging, because I heard at a big podcasting conference one time that you should not be giving the listeners this laundry list of all these things that you want them to take action on. I sort of agree with that. I sort of disagree with it. I understand the premise behind it. I also think that different things are going to resonate with different people. So I think if I tell you that there's a Facebook group, you might say, awesome, I'd love to talk with other like-minded people who obviously must listen to his show. There might be people that say, I'm one of the few people that's not even on Facebook, or I just don't like Facebook. I like Twitter, or I like Instagram. So that's not going to be of interest to you. But if I tell you about buying my ebooks, you might say, well, he gives out a lot of good tips, and I'm a musician that my career needs some help. I'll go download his ebooks. If I'm telling you that if you shop on Amazon, to click on the Amazon banner at nhte.net, you might say, oh gosh, that's fine. I shop on Amazon all the time. I need help with how much I shop on it. So I think that, like I said, it's not as bad as people make it out to. I think the spirit with which that was said was, you're going to overwhelm your listeners with so many that they're not going to take action on any of the stuff you're asking them to. I don't know. I think that's different for everyone. Another piece of advice I'd like to give, if you don't mind, is I had somebody say to me, I don't think anybody's listening to the podcast. And I said, why is that? And the answer was, well, because I never get any emails from any listeners. And I thought, well, okay, I know that I personally, Bruce, I do most of my podcast listening when I'm driving. So if I'm driving and I'm listening to a podcast and someone's giving out an email address, what do I need that for? I don't really have, I'm enjoying the show. I like it. Just keep doing what you're doing. And yeah, someone can argue, well, I'd love to get an email saying that. I love your show. Keep doing what you're doing. But if you're driving and you don't have a way to write it down, and you're not that motivated to write someone just to say, I love what you're doing, keep it up, then you just go and look at your stats. Your stats might not be that great, but it'll show you people are listening. They're just not writing in. That's all. Don't worry about it. And do a self-audit and say, well, wait a minute. Of the podcasts that I listen to, have I ever emailed the host? Probably not. So don't be upset and think that your show has got 0 listeners just because you never hear from anybody. And if people are joining your Facebook group, or if, like I said, it's simply as if you look at your stats and you see, okay, my stats aren't what I want them to be, but I can see people are listening. There you go. You have an audience.
Yeah, that's great advice. Some people may just feel like they're not getting much feedback, because podcasting doesn't really give you much feedback. And I've already realized that. I mean, I can look at iTunes reviews and you can get like a one moment piece of feedback from someone, but it's not like they go in there and leave another review and give you another comment. So it's not as much of like a community aspect where there's a lot of interaction, but there's a lot of people that just listen in.
Well, and a lot of it has to do with the subject matter and the age of your show, because Now Hear This Entertainment is more than it's closer to 5.5 years old. And over time, I've gotten listeners from 147 countries around the world. Now, with Catholic Sports Radio, it's still new. There's only 24 episodes out, but I get lots of emails from listeners on that show. So obviously just that they're more emotional or they're more moved to want to write to me for whatever reason. And I'm not saying either one is right or wrong or either one is more successful than the other. I'm just saying that different strokes for different folks. And like you just said, people are going to engage to whatever level they really feel that they're called to.
Oh, that's awesome to hear. So, we jumped into the advice piece a little earlier than I usually do. So I'd like to go back to a couple of questions real quick. What's inspiring you most about the future of your podcast or the future of just what it is that you're doing? You now have 2 podcasts. You have these speaking events that are popping up. You're going to these conferences as, featured guests. But what's inspiring you most about the future?
There's a couple opportunities that I'm in discussions about right now that I can't talk about at this time that do excite me, but also seeing those speaking engagements getting booked excites me. I really put the pressure on myself to try to get more of those. Earlier this year, I launched a website called speakerbrucew.com, and that shows people that, okay, this guy really is out there doing speaking engagements. There's a video on that website that shows me speaking in Orlando, me speaking in Washington, D.C., me speaking in Las Vegas, me speaking in Tampa. And you watch that reel and you see here's an entire website devoted to him being a speaker. And okay, this is more than just, oh, by the way, listeners, if you got an event going on that I could be a part of, get in touch. I'd love to speak at it. Those are 2 totally different approaches. So when people hear speakerbrucew.com, you've got your own website just for speaking. They say, okay, obviously this is something that is a regular part of what he does. And I've also learned something from the ebook series that I did for Now Hear This Entertainment that is now inspiring me to start at least laying down the foundation on paper in terms of formulating a strategy towards, and it's completely unrelated, but a book that I'm going to want to put out in hard copy form. So that's something that really has me excited.
Yeah, that's awesome. More speaking events. You got an official website up. I just pulled it up. It looks great. And then another book in the pipeline and some other stuff we're not allowed to hear about yet.
Yeah, for sure. It is exciting.
Well, what's your favorite part about being a content creator?
This is going to sound biased because it is the firstborn child, but the contacts that I make through Now Hear This Entertainment, these new relationships, it really is exciting because you never know where it's going to go. And granted, I've done 284 episodes as you and I talk today. So I'm not here to tell you that everyone has been a home run. And there's certain ones that you go, well, I delivered another episode this week and that's it. And nothing ever comes from that. But it is really exciting meeting so many people that there's no way that I could have gotten near a lot of these people if I was just Bruce with Now Hear This Incorporated. And so to be able to not only quote unquote get an audience with them, but have a hearty conversation for more than 45 minutes, it really excites me because then it also tells me I'm going to continue to get better guests like this. And I know that opportunities are going to come from them. And you don't necessarily start thinking of, ooh, maybe someday I can get John Bon Jovi, or ooh, maybe someday I can get Bruce Springsteen. And in fact, I have kind of I don't want to say a strategy, but an attitude towards why I don't necessarily look to get Bruce Springsteen someday, because he's going to talk at a level or I'm going to talk at a level that he's not going to be able to relate to. So I'm going to say, I like to ask a lot of how-to type questions to my guests because I know there are listeners who themselves are up-and-coming performers. And so when they hear that someone just got their latest recording project entirely funded through a crowdfunding campaign, they want to know, well, how did they do that? Or they got their music placed in film and television. And so I'll ask that to a guest. How did you get your music placed on such and such a show on ABC, and they'll say, yeah, that was really great. A lot of good things came from that. I was really happy. And I'll say, no, how did you do it? There are listeners who want to know. Did you know somebody that works for the show? Did you use an agency? Did you do it on your own? And then the light bulb goes on. So I get excited that, okay, I'm helping these listeners out. Whereas if I asked that question to Bruce Springsteen, how did you get your music placed on that show? He'd say, what are you talking about? I'm Bruce Springsteen. I can get my music placed anywhere I want, pretty much. And so to be able to get the kind of guests I have and get excited that I can continue to get more like this without having to have this weird pie in the sky vision that wouldn't necessarily fit the show. That's what keeps me going, and just continue to make those connections. And when I do travel and I get to meet some of the people in person, and I'll tell you what, as crazy as it sounds, what I really love, I almost feel like a proud dad when I actually get to see them perform. Because when all you do is talk to the person and you don't actually get to experience them in person doing what it is that they do, which is performing, you all of a sudden go, look at this is awesome. You know, there's a guest that I've had on the show twice. They're sisters, and I just went to see them perform at the House of Blues in Orlando in the Disney area, and the place was packed. And to see them on this stage in this packed house, and that's exactly what this podcast is. It's people like that are having that kind of success, but you still feel so proud, and you say, this is exciting. This keeps me motivated to keep doing this week after week.
That's awesome. That's really awesome. So we talked a lot about advice for newer podcasters and people that are entering the world of influence, but do you have any advice for people that are more established, like people that already have their platform and they already have their message clearly defined? And like, is there anything that you feel like you're doing that's different than other people that you're finding success with that could help level up someone who's already established?
Well, there's a lot of different channels out there. So if someone, say, is already podcasting, I would encourage them to also do a blog, or vice versa. For instance, I've been doing both for quite a long time. I started the podcast in February of 2014, and then it was late September of that year that I started up a weekly blog. And I don't mind telling you, sometimes that is a real challenge. I think that's a little bit of a pain point, in that when I'm doing Now Hear This Entertainment, it's just a matter of who's the guest going to be. But when I'm doing the blog, it's, okay, Bruce, it's all on you. What are you going to write about? And what are you going to write about that you haven't already written about? So that becomes challenging. But at the same time, you can use them to cross-promote one another. But at the same time, you can also do different things with both of those. And some people, like I was saying before, some people may respond to the call for the Amazon banner, whereas other people might respond to the call for the Facebook group. Some people might just prefer reading blogs. Other people might say, oh my gosh, I wouldn't even know where to begin. I don't have the time to sit and read this stuff. But if I can listen to a podcast while I'm driving, that speaks to me, or while I'm out for a run, or when I'm working out at the gym. So I would encourage people to explore some of these different channels and really, leverage them to the max, because I have this whole cross-promote and then cross-promote circle that I create, which is, if you buy my ebooks, then there are links within the ebooks to go to the podcast. And so if all of a sudden you're listening to the podcast and you hear me say, oh, by the way, I wrote about this in a recent blog, go to nhte.net and look for the blog entitled, and I'll say what the headline was. Now all of a sudden they went from reading your ebook to listening to your podcast to reading your blog. And I'm old-fashioned. I still believe in driving web traffic and keeping people kind of, within your brand, within your company. So the more that you can do that and leverage some of these different vehicles, I even have an e-newsletter that comes out every Wednesday morning, which basically just promotes that week's episode of the podcast. I mean, I'll talk about other stuff that I'm up to so that people do see that, oh, you can hire him for speaking. I didn't know that. And needless to say, when I launched that speakerbrucew.com, I wrote about that in the newsletter. But these are just all different things that people can use, different channels that they can activate so that you're going to touch people some way, whether it's they respond to one or the other. If you're getting out in front of people who otherwise hadn't heard of you before, well, now your message is getting wider and wider exposure, and it's only going to benefit you in the long run.
That's great advice. Well, I appreciate you coming here and sharing your why. I'd like to end the episode by giving you an opportunity to talk about anything else you would like to talk about, whether it's your website, your speaking website, your podcast, your ebook, anything else you'd like to shout out.
Just the fact that one thing that has been an eye-opener for me is when I wrote the ebooks, I thought that I was just writing them for the up-and-coming musicians who wanted the tips that I give out. And that's a strategy that people should learn, is you don't have to recreate the wheel. If it's something that you're already doing, you can just repurpose that content. But what I started to realize is, as I was getting interviewed on more and more shows that weren't music shows, I would have the host say, please send me 1 or 2 volumes in your ebook series ahead of time so that I can look through them and be familiar with the content. And they would start to say, quote unquote, on the air, you know, Bruce, I looked at your ebooks and the information you're giving out is not just for entertainers. I find a lot of these tips to be useful in business and for small business owners to look at. And so that kind of opened my eyes up, and it made me feel that I guess I have something to offer to a wider audience than I originally intended it to be. So people can go to brucesbonusbook.com and they'll see the 4 volumes that I have there that you can download. And now I can say that don't be thrown by the cover, don't be thrown by the title. Once you start digging into the content, you'll see that, wow, these tips actually do apply to me, and I have nothing to do with entertainment or music.
Okay, great. And I'll have links to all your stuff on the episode page on our website, and I'll include the brucesbonusbook.com link on there as well.
Great, thank you.
Well, Bruce, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your why. I really appreciate you coming on here and being vulnerable with us. Look forward to maybe speaking to you again sometime in the future as you're more established with your new podcast. And I look forward to seeing your influence keep on growing.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Jeremy. And congratulations to you on getting your podcast well out the door. It's good to see that this has benefits. And I'm really impressed that you're using what your own story is to show people the old, if I can do it, then anybody can, kind of, practice what you preach approach.
Awesome. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Sure. All the best.
Well, that concludes this interview. Thanks so much for listening to the interview in its entirety. Bruce, thanks again for coming on the show and being vulnerable and sharing your why. Bruce shared so much value and so many tips in this interview that there's way too many for me to cover with you guys here during the outro. But I'm going to just recap a few points that I think are important that I picked up, and I hope that's valuable for you. If you're looking to do a podcast, Bruce really emphasized the power of podcast hosting services. Here at Y Influence, we use Libsyn. If you look up some podcast hosting services, then you'll see Libsyn's one of the major ones. Bruce started out with hosting his podcast on WordPress, and that just doesn't work because when you release the podcast episode, you get a bunch of initial traffic going to that audio file, and the servers can't handle it. It's not designed for it. You really need some kind of hosting service to handle that kind of bandwidth that hits the episode, and also for pushing out to other platforms. Even Bruce said to today, his first podcast, which he's had for years, is still not on iHeartRadio, and it's because he doesn't have that integration. As you guys know, I am struggling with getting more guests for the show, and Bruce suggested that you be more vocal with asking for recommendations. Maybe after the interview, you can really emphasize the fact that you're looking for more guests in a certain space and get some referrals, and that works really well. And I haven't really been pushing as hard with that, and maybe that's something that can help me get more guests on here. Bruce really emphasized the fact that you need a Facebook group or some kind of place for a community to sit that you can drive traffic to from the get-go. I don't have one for this podcast, so I will be creating one sometime in the future. I haven't really figured out where I want it to sit. I'm not a huge Facebook user personally, so I don't know if I want it on Facebook. But anyway, you just want somewhere for your community to sit, and you want to drive the traffic to there from the beginning, because if you start that later, you're going to miss out on all the opportunities of getting people through your whole journey to join that group and be part of your community. And it's just better to start that early. When Bruce started his most recent podcast, he did a press release talking about the announcement of it, and it actually caught some traction and drove some traffic his way. So that was a really smart move for him to release a press release when launching his podcast. So that's something to consider when launching your podcast. Bruce talked about how you should look at your stats, and even if you're not getting feedback, just know that if the stats show that you're getting downloads and getting listens, then people are listening. Don't get upset because you're not hearing from those people, because the way podcasting works is you put the content out there, people consume it. Really, the only way that you initially get an interaction from them is through a review, which not a lot of people leave reviews for podcasts. So you don't really get a lot of interaction. You don't know if people are actually consuming the content, if they're liking it, especially if you don't have anywhere to send a community to have dialogue about it. It's very difficult. So don't get upset because you don't hear from people. Just give it time and just keep posting. Bruce talked a lot about the power of blogging. If you have a podcast, then you should be blogging. If you have a blog, you should be podcasting. But then you can cross promote between the platforms. Now that Bruce is more established in his podcast, he has an ebook and he does public speaking. So he just sort of uses one to promote the other and to promote the other, and just sort of cross promotes his own content now that he has these different platforms that he can send people to. Bruce talked about the importance of having a newsletter. He sends one out weekly with a podcast episode as well as news, or if he's speaking, and anything else he wants to put in there. And then he talks a lot about repurposing content. So if you have some content you've already created, maybe there's ways to repurpose it so you don't have to put as much effort into creating more and more content. Now, transitioning to my journey here at the Why Influence podcast, I asked Bruce for some feedback based on his experience, and he gave me a few points that I'll share with you guys because I thought it was valuable. When I schedule the interview with someone, I send them a Google Doc, and in that Google Doc has a list of questions, basically just the types of questions I'll be asking during the interview. And to Bruce, it wasn't really clear that I may ask questions that aren't on that list, or I may dive deeper into other topics. So he just gave some pointers to just emphasize that it's sort of a guideline, but not really set in stone. So I'll just make some tweaks to the questionnaire that I send. I also tell people that an interview takes an average of 45 minutes, and when they book it with me, the calendar books 45 minutes. You know, this was a longer episode. Bruce was a little worried that we're going to run out of time because we're going over the time limit that we talked about. It wasn't really clear to him that I had some flexibility in that. You know, if it's good conversation, we're getting a lot of value, then I'm okay with it going a little bit longer. He suggested that I just set an expectation that that's an option so that it's clear for the guests. I thought I did a pretty good job in this interview. I felt pretty natural, and I felt like the conversation flowed pretty well, and it went a little bit out of order, and I was able to just flow and make it work. So I'm pretty proud of myself for how this interview turned out. And yeah, that's pretty much it. If you're new here, then please hit the subscribe button. If you're a returning listener, thanks for tuning in again. Please go to iTunes and leave us a review if you haven't already. Those reviews help us get bigger and better guests. If you want to learn more about Bruce, just go to our website, and you can see in the show notes links to all his stuff, whyinfluence.com, whyinfluence.com, episode 13. It's going to have all Bruce's info in there. I'd also like to note that once I hit 30 interviews, then I'm going to schedule a live interview where Nathan interviews me on the podcast, asking me about how things are going, and just doing another catch-up interview after we hit 30. And we're doing that live. So if you want to tune in for that, or be notified when that's going to be so you can see if you want to tune in, then just subscribe to our newsletter. We're going to send out an email blast and let you guys know when that's going to happen. So just on our website, you scroll to the bottom and you can subscribe to our email newsletter, and we'll send an email just saying, hey, you know, the live interview is going to happen at this time and this date. It's not scheduled yet because I don't have 30 interviews done, so I don't know when that's going to be. And that's it. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to the Why Influence podcast. Bruce, thanks again for coming on the show, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.